All right, hello students. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of the millennials with this material focusing a little bit more on who the millennials are in terms of a lot of their values, right? What do they actually kind of believe about the world? How is their morality shaped? And all of that sort of stuff. Okay, so the millennials at this phase in their life, what do they actually believe? Like, what's their ideological system? And I think, we can say that for the most part, what gets set in adolescence and emerging adulthood ultimately ends up being pretty much what people adopt going forward. Okay, so we talk about the millennials. What can we say? Well, most of them at this point in their lives are basically, I would say, postmodernist in their kind of ideology, right? Mostly, I say this in the sense that they are skeptical about the possibility of objective truth, right? They don't believe necessarily that there is anything objective that can be discovered, right? There isn't a truth out there that you can get access to by applying your reason. Basically, everything is limited to our own subjectivity, right? And this is very much a kind of postmodernist belief. You couldn't find a better distillation of it, say, in Foucault or in Jacques Derrida than you would find in kind of some of the interviews that Smith and Snell and their team were doing, right? And one of the things that Smith says when, one interviewer tried to ask them whether morality was based on objective or universal qualities or standards or simply relative to human inventions, a lot of people couldn't understand what the interviewer was trying to ask. Like, they tried rephrases, they tried re-explaining and all of these sorts of things, and it just didn't make any sense. The notion of anything being based on objective or universal qualities didn't make sense to most millennials. It's simply something that is outside of their ideological wheelhouse in major ways. So this is the quote. It seems they cannot, for whatever reason, believe in or sometimes even conceive of a given objective truth, fact, reality, or nature of the world that is independent of their subjective self-experience, and that in relation to which they and others might learn or be persuaded to change. And so this is interesting, right? Especially when we think about religion. And I mean, obviously, that's the purpose of this course. Religion, and especially Western forms of religion, the three Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are all predicated very much on the notion that there is an objective standard that all things can be judged against. That is God, or God's will, or that God stands as the object of ultimate truth, especially when it comes to things like, say, morality. But for the millennials that Smith and Snell were talking to, all there is really is subjective self-experience, right? There is no independent or objective fact that you need to be kind of making reference to at the end of the day. So, I mean, that's just kind of where they are. In terms of morality, there is something very interesting with what Smith and Snell found with regards to how millennials conceive of morality, right? And their conception is that right and wrong are easy to discern despite no objective standards, which is interesting, right? If there's nothing to judge it against, how do you know that anything's right or wrong? How could you measure something being right or wrong? And I think we are probably best kind of summing up how millennials feel about right and wrong in terms of subjectivism, or I think even more properly, emotivism, what Carl Trueman calls emotivism, the kind of fundamental logic of kind of late modernity. And I think that's where we're at. So morality, for millennials at this phase in their life, and honestly, I think this probably continues on well after, is common sense. How do you know what's moral? Well, you attend to your subjective feelings or intuitions, right? You just feel what is morally right. And while they can't necessarily tell you where morality comes from, they kind of sense that it's been implanted in them when they were children by parents and teachers, right? So it's relatively unproblematic. So the other thing is living in terms of right and wrong should be relatively effortless, right? Because it's relatively simple, it's common sense. You just follow your common sense and your feelings, your intuitions. And you should be able to live a moral life with relative ease. Okay, so one of the key things to know about the millennials is that they are what Smith calls moral consequentialists. Now, rule number one for the millennials in terms of morality is don't do any harm to others. Like, don't hurt other people. Now, what hurts other people, right, is kind of bound up in this notion of moral consequentialism. So something is moral or immoral not based on some kind of objective standard, right? It's not because God said so or there's some kind of natural law written into the world or anything like this. That's not the way it works. But it's based on the consequences of an action to other people and yourself. So an action is only immoral if it harms someone else, right? This is like if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, doesn't make a sound. An action is only immoral. Like if you do an action and nobody's harmed, it's not immoral, right? So yeah, it might be immoral to cheat on a test if it's going to impact other people, right? If you're all competing for a scholarship, say, and whoever gets the highest score on the test would get the scholarship. But let's say you're in a circumstance where, you know, you're in a class, the class is not curved, and so if you cheat on the test, you get a better grade and it doesn't harm anybody else, then it wouldn't be immoral on a moral consequentialist level to cheat on the test, right? It's only if you get caught that it's a problem. Yeah, now, one of the things that Smith says is that this notion of you shouldn't hurt other people is a sort of taken for granted, but one that millennials found really difficult, to articulate why they shouldn't hurt other people. He calls it a free-floating, unjustified supposition. It's just common sense. That, right, the second you start doing harm to others, you've stepped into a different realm, and that then becomes immoral. But why? What is it about doing harm to others that isn't permissible, right? Why should that be? Why is doing harm to others inherently what makes something moral or immoral? They had a hard time articulating it. I mean, it was just common sense that you shouldn't harm other people, but is there a philosophical foundation to that idea? Not that they could articulate. Okay. There's also these kinds of vague religious notions that sort of float around with the millennials, right? You know, notions of karma, what goes around comes around, karma's a bitch, what you put out in the universe comes back to you, right? These fairly pop culture-y type ways of explaining, you know, how good and bad operate in the world and how moral actions will come to influence people at the end of the day. Okay, so millennials, basically Smith says, display what he calls a deep moral relativism, right? And again, this is, I think, consistent with the fact that they are fundamentally kind of postmodern in their orientations, right? Whether they know it or not, whether they've read a word of it or not, their philosophical notions of the world are deeply shaped by postmodern thinkers like Michel Foucault, like Jacques Derrida, you know, like Baudrillard, like Lyotard, and all these postmodern thinkers, right, that have been really, really prominent. They're all shaped really, really deeply by this. So when you ask, right, what's right versus what's wrong, the kind of responses that you tend to get from millennials is, well, everybody's different, but for me, blah, blah, blah. You know, for me, I'm allowed to do this, not allowed to do that. And so they come to this perspective, right, that nobody can impose or presume the perspective of another person, right? So we cannot know in any reliable way what is right for me, what is right for you. It is a complete sort of black box in a sense, right? It's totally black box. I don't know what's right for you. You don't know what's right for me. Let's call the whole thing off, right? We can't impose morality on each other. We can't assume that your morality is right for me and my morality is right for you. Now, of course, this is also driven by a deep pluralism in kind of Western societies, right? Where people are, exposed to people of different religions and such. And so it has this very deep kind of root to it, but it's very relativistic, right? Every individual is different, and they have to decide morality for themselves, right? There's no morality that can be imposed from the outside. Again, there's no objective standard, right? There's nothing to anchor any of this down. And so it's all about what you believe and what's right for you, not like somebody else's rules. So by the time they had moved into adulthood, right, as they're entering adulthood, right, they're crossing that 18-year-old birthday kind of threshold and moving into emerging adulthood. Most millennials were becoming more tolerant of gays and lesbians, right, and as time went on, right, this was extended on to bisexual, transgender, queer, and other kind of people within that kind of descriptor. And this was, I think, a big change, right? Where when they were growing up, a lot of the kind of culture war battles around pride and about LGBTQ people were being fought. But by the time they start to come into adulthood, many of them are becoming more tolerant of it, right? They've known more out gay people. They're more accustomed to gay people. And obviously, people who are LGBTQ plus were more part of kind of contemporary culture. I mean, people point back to particular moments of pop culture as being super relevant in this, right? There was a show called Will and Grace where one of the main characters, Will, was a gay man. And so they had, you know, a bunch of LGBTQ people kind of circulating around the main cast, people they dated and these sorts of things. Um, and while I wouldn't want to overstate the role of pop culture in reshaping attitudes, definitely there were more gay and lesbian kind of representations out there. The stigma was starting to be lessened, right? And there have been some prominent kind of legal rulings, on the rights of LGBTQ people that were making things more tolerant. Now, I mean, by 2010, especially in the US, we still hadn't crossed the threshold of say, same-sex marriage becoming constitutionally protected. That didn't happen until 2015 with Obergefell v. Hodges. But people were already kind of moving in this direction. Okay, they're also more kind of liberal on the use of substances. Many of them had been experimenting at least with marijuana. Marijuana, very common for the millennials to be using. So they've been experimenting with marijuana and other substances, ecstasy, in particular. And they thought of themselves as quite open-minded on substances. By the time they kind of reached emerging adulthood, more of them had also become sexually active. Hookup culture was more the norm in a lot of cases. And so they kind of took that to mean that they were more open-minded than their parents because they were, I guess, I don't want to say cool with having sex. They were more open to, different kinds of sexual engagements, right? And less sex related to long-term relationships, much more kind of casual sex, driven by a bunch of cultural changes that are not necessarily important to talk about, at this stage. So in terms of their cultural relativism, one of the things that's really, I think, key to thinking about the millennials and who they are and what they believe is that fundamentally the millennials at the end of the day are what we would call social constructionists. What does that mean, right? So basically that there are no givens, right? There are no inherent things like, the differences between, say, how we conceive of masculinity or femininity are not given, right? There's nothing biological or ingrained or anything about the structure of reality that leads it to be thus, but it's all simply a social construct, right? That basically human beings are the product of social construction, right? And all of our values, norms, and things that we believe are basically created by society and maintained by social structures, right? So there's nothing given about any particular piece of morality even, right? That, if there are norms around theft or sexuality or any of that, that it is all socially constructed at the end of the day. And so when we think of like subjectivism and I think emotivism, again, Carl Trueman, in his book, the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, makes this point as well, that really from the millennials on, morality comes to be framed in subjective and emotional terms. And so on moral statements, and even statements of fact in a lot of ways, millennials, and I think Gen Z falls into this category as well, will tend to phrase things in I feel statements. Like, I feel that this is wrong because I feel that, XYZ, rather than I think, right? Because their fundamental moral basis is not in thought, right? It's not in rationality, it's in the subjective and the emotional. Okay, so a little bit different from, say, some of their, I think, older peers, right? When we talk about the millennials as compared to boomers or Gen Xers, into emerging adulthood, things were still much more in flux, right? They were uncertain about their purpose in life, and they had a lot of time to figure it out. One of the reasons that we started talking about emerging adulthood rather than, you hit 18 and you're an adult, is because it was noticed that there's this kind of period of transition, right? You're out of adolescence, but you're still not fully integrated into adult life. And so we sort of set this category roughly like 19 to 29, where people are sort of sorting out the parts of adulthood that they need to fully be kind of part of the adult world. And part of this is like, still trying to figure out their purpose in life, still trying to figure things out. And so some people have called kind of emerging adulthood a period of prolonged adolescence or extended adolescence, where people are still trying to figure out who they are, right? And all of these sorts of things. Education too for the millennials kind of changed in its purpose compared to other generations, right? For say the baby boomers or Gen X, getting a university education in particular was part of this process of, almost learning the wisdom of the past, right? Up until really recently, like one of the most popular courses on university campuses was Western civilization, right? Where basically you got an education sort of in, the classics of Western civilization and the history of Western civilization. Now these fell out of favor, I think, for fairly obvious reasons as people started to reconsider, some of the positives and negatives, and especially the negatives, that the West had brought into the world through colonialism, imperialism, and these sorts of things. But it does point to the fact that in the past, right, learning about things like the great intellectual tradition of the West, right, especially things like literature and philosophy, things like why did people take Shakespeare and why was Shakespeare so core to an education in English? Because he was thought to be one of the great authors, right? And so there was this notion for the boomers and Gen X that you were linking yourself into a great tradition, right? And this would help you yourself become a better person because you were absorbing the wisdom of the past. Now, this changes fundamentally for the millennials. Maybe it's the kind of breakdown of grand narratives, right? Driven by postmodernism. I'm not entirely certain what has sort of led to this change. And there's probably history books written on this that could speak to it better than I can. But for whatever reason, the millennials start to think of education as basically just about getting a job, right? It's about a credential in order to get a job. Now, there's probably aspects of the job market that play here as well, in that, people certainly start looking at the undergraduate degree specifically as a credential and almost as the base credential in the way a high school diploma used to be, right? To prove that you're reasonably intelligent, it used to be that you just presented your high school diploma, you were able to get through high school, you must be kind of reasonably smart. Today, much more difficult, right? Now it's much more can you get a university degree, right? Are you smart enough to make it through a 4-year university degree? And that's kind of the base credential. And so a lot of this like civilizational civics kind of basis to education that used to be kind of at the core now has, I think, fundamentally broken down. And it's really just a credential printing institution for the most part. Yeah, so for the millennials, drug use pervasive in terms of culture, principally marijuana, right? Most millennials never went beyond marijuana. It's a very small percentage of them that thought that they should go, into harder drugs. Though obviously some do, but the drugs of choice were alcohol and marijuana for the most part. Now this, by the time they hit emerging adulthood, right, by the time they get out of high school and they get through college, especially, and they're entering kind of their first jobs, most had reduced or gotten bored of taking drugs. It would be something that they principally do now and then, right? They don't smoke a lot of pot and they don't drink a lot. It's just something that happens, maybe amongst friends every other time. Now their attitudes are still much more liberal towards it, which is, principally why drug laws start to get liberalized when the millennials start to be a really important demographic, right? Like it's only now, really, in the last few years that millennials have really started taking their place in the public sphere, that we're really starting to see drug culture and kind of permissiveness around drugs becoming mainstream. Okay, so with millennials, we saw a continuation of a trend that had really started with Generation X, in that a shift in kind of relationships and how people think about relationships. So the average age of marriage has been steadily rising for a while, but with millennials in particular, they got married far later than their parents did. Their parents were mostly boomers, right? Tended to get married in their early 20s, and with millennials, we're seeing it more late 20s, early 30s. Part of it is this notion of kind of emerging adulthood or those first years of adulthood as periods of trying things, traveling, securing your own individuality, and then thinking about maybe getting married, right? But your youth is that time to try things, find your passion, travel, and all that jazz. Once that's done, and also like once you've secured your financial well-being, then you can think about settling down. Career, stability, income come before marriage and children, which are seen more as capstones, right? Now you've kind of made it, and now you can think about having kids and all that stuff. Relationships a little bit more amorphous, I think, for the millennials. They display a much more of a preference for detachment in relationships, and things kind of progress very slowly through phases, right? So it starts with friends, hanging out, dating, friends with benefits, semi-cohabiting, cohabiting. And you get, particular vocabulary that comes from the millennials, right? Things like the define the relationship talk, because there can't be an assumption that just because you're in a relationship and you're seeing each other, and maybe even that you're having sex, that you're actually dating, right? That there's all of these possible kind of ways that relationships can be very amorphous and undefined. So you have to have a talk that defines the relationship. Millennials are really the first generation where we see hookup culture taking on a really big part of the culture, right? So hooking up, kind of defined in various ways, from kissing to sexual intercourse, becomes the norm, especially in the college years, for how people interact sexually. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later in the course. Yeah, and I mean, marriage becomes this thing, almost a luxury product. With the millennials, we see, especially amongst the working class, marriage becoming far less common. Cohabitation becomes the norm, and people will tend to cohabit a lot. Average length of a cohabiting relationship is about 3 years. But people think of it in a lot of ways as a buffer, or a buffer against possible future divorce, like testing out the relationship. I heard just not that long ago a clip with, I think it was the Whatever podcast, I don't recall, where one of the participants, and I don't listen to Whatever, but I just heard one of the clips, basically said that you haven't really dated someone until you've lived together, because you don't know what they're like in terms of their everyday life. And that I think kind of fits in some ways, the millennial mindset, right? Like you cohabit to see what people are like because you wouldn't want something that annoys you about them to ultimately come between you and them and break up a relationship once it's kind of in a more established phase, especially once there's kids. So living together is supposed to be a test drive of the relationship. Although fundamentally, if you want to talk sociological data, that doesn't really work out. It's not as secure as I think most of them probably would want. So most of them, in terms of kind of their desire and their beliefs about what's going to happen in their lives, fundamentally, I think you could say they're mostly living the American dream, right? They think of consumer culture as what they expect to live in, and living a good life means a life with a lot of consumption. And there's really no morality attached to consumption for the millennials, right? If you can afford your purchases, you're entitled to. So, climate change be damned or whatever, right? If you can afford that Mexican trip, then why shouldn't you take it? Much less commonly, right, it was a notion of the common good, some sense that we should take care of each other, right, that you should be participating in things that do good for the world. But for most of them, that kind of notion, even things like volunteering and donation, is something you would do much later in life. Again, it's a kind of a capstone, right? You're going to get to that stuff after you're done your travel, after you're done discovering yourself, after you're done, kind of establishing yourself. Then when you have excess income, you can think about volunteering or doing something good for the world. And what most of them seem to aspire to is a middle class lifestyle. It's the same lifestyle that for the most part a lot of their parents had, or the one that their parents were probably aspiring to. So while very optimistic, the millennials are also very cynical. Basically, they doubt the power to change the world for the better. They're sort of nihilistic in this way, right? Well, they see social norms as constructed, right? They see themselves as impotent to change society, which is a weird thing. Like if everything's socially constructed, it should be relatively easy to change, but that's not how they see it. Um, yeah, and what Smith and Snell note is that they're submerged in their interpersonal relationships, right? They're in this phase where all they really care about is the people around them, and there's very little engagement with the cultural, ethical debates facing U.S. or global society. Citizenship's not something they think about, and none of them have a vision of what you might call the common good. And I think we can say that this is maybe part of a breakdown in civics education, where they've not been sort of deeply inculcated with that, I don't know, Kennedy like sense. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's very much the opposite for millennials. It's ask not what you can do for your country, ask what your country can do for you, right? And so it's all about me, interpersonal relationship. But this is why Jin Twenge fundamentally calls millennials Generation Me, or complains that with millennials we're in the midst of a narcissism epidemic, right? The sense that there might be some way that we each need to contribute to a common good is not something that's well articulated for millennials, right? Yeah, I mean, really what they're happiest about, like what they find joy in is, good relationships with family, friends, interesting acquaintances and associates, maybe romantic relationships. Increasingly carefully managed technologically, right, through social media. So we're seeing, especially at the tail end of millennials, much of this being mitigated by or dominated by social media interactions. And that's basically the millennials in a nutshell, right? That's kind of who they are, what they value, and we'll talk in a little bit here about their religious lives.